In March 1895, a 72-year-old diplomat named Li Hongzhang was shot in the cheek on a street in Shimonoseki, Japan. The bullet lodged just below his left eye. He refused to let Japanese surgeons remove it. 8 days later, wearing a bandaged head and a bloodied Qing robe, he signed away Taiwan to the Empire of Japan in perpetuity. The restaurant where he signed it still operates. The table, the chairs, the inkstones, and Li's brush are still on display. And 130 years later, that signature is still doing work. This video is about why Taiwan existing, not Taiwan doing anything provocative, not declaring independence, not acquiring nuclear weapons, just continuing to exist as it currently does, is enough to generate the most dangerous military pressure in the world right now. Most analysis of the Taiwan question focuses on what might trigger a crisis, like a declaration of independence, an American provocation, or a miscalculation at sea. That framing misreads what is really happening. The pressure traces back to a narrative Xi Jinping installed as the operating system of the Chinese Communist Party in his first weeks in power, and that narrative has been generating its own pressure towards closure ever since. To see why, start in a museum. 11 days after taking over as General Secretary in November 2012, Xi's first major public appearance was a visit to the National Museum of China. He brought the entire 7-member Politburo Standing Committee, all matching dark suits, no overcoats. They walked through an exhibition called The Road of Rejuvenation. The architecture of the exhibition does most of the work. Late Qing rooms have oppressive dark gray walls. The walls lighten as the visitor advances. At the mock-up of Tiananmen 1949, they turn bright red. After liberation, pink, then white. The Cultural Revolution decade is a near empty lobby, the missing years rendered as negative space. A wall map of the period marks each treaty session, in red, the loss of Taiwan in 1895 among them. Xi has called the 1895 cession of Taiwan the most painful chapter in the history of the Chinese nation. At this visit, he delivered his first major speech as leader. He introduced what he began calling the Chinese dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and he listed 2 centenaries. 2021, the parties, and 2049, the people's republics. The dream will be realized by 2049. That is the frame. Everything else in this video is downstream of it. The Chinese language framing of the cross-strait question is different from the English language framing, and the difference does most of the work. The 1982 PRC Constitution opens by calling China, quote, a country with one of the longest histories in the world, end quote, presenting the People's Republic as the continuation of a 5,000-year-old civilization rather than as a state founded in 1949. The preamble's 9th paragraph reads, quote, Taiwan is part of the sacred territory of the People's Republic of China, end quote. What many people don't realize is that the Republic of China, which governs Taiwan and a handful of smaller islands, does something similar. Its 1947 constitution, promulgated in Nanjing and never formally revoked, still claims sovereignty over the entire mainland. In English, this looks like 2 countries arguing over an island, the People's Republic of China versus the Republic of China. In Mandarin, the difference nearly disappears. One is Zhonghua Renmin Zhonghe Guo. The other is Zhonghua Minguo. Both open on Zhonghua, the Chinese nation, and both close on Guo, the state. Strip out the 4 characters in the middle that mean People's Republic. This is not 2 countries arguing over a border. It is 2 governments laying claim to the same identity under almost the same name. For most of the PRC's history, its leaders agreed to leave that contradiction part. Deng Xiaoping shelved it under 1 country, 2 systems with no timeline. His operative phrase was Tao Guang Yang Hui, hide your strength, bide your time. Cross-strait reunification, he said, could await the wisdom of future generations. Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao kept it shelved because their version of rejuvenation was running on GDP and cross-strait economic ties tight enough that the contradiction would atrophy on its own. Xi reads the same architecture and concludes that patience is precisely what destroys regimes like his. To see why his frame works the way it does, it helps to borrow a concept from outside politics. In 1962, the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn published The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and his argument about how scientific theories live and die turns out to describe the party's master story unusually well. Kuhn's claim was that a paradigm does not survive because it is true. It survives because it keeps generating answers without exposing its own contradictions. A paradigm dies when the anomalies it cannot explain accumulate faster than the explanations it can generate. For most of the 20th century, the party's master story was Marxist-Leninist class struggle, and Taiwan was a Cold War prop at the edge of the map, easily absorbed. Under Xi, the master story has been swapped out. The story is now the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, with a closing date of 2049 and a single visible piece missing from the puzzle. Inside that new paradigm, a self-governing Taiwan becomes the central anomaly. It is the one piece left that, left unresolved, the rejuvenation story cannot absorb. For 40 years, the anomaly was absorbable because of how Taiwan was described. Douglas MacArthur, in a 1950 memorandum, called the island, in hostile hands, an unsinkable aircraft carrier and submarine tender. The description stuck. Through the Cold War, Taiwan was understood as an American geography that happened to be Chinese, awaiting its eventual return to the embrace of the rising motherland. Under that description, the implicit comparison flattered the mainland. The numbers no longer support that description. Taiwan's GDP per capita on a purchasing power parity basis crossed Japan's in 2022 and South Korea's in 2023. The IMF's 2024 figures put it at roughly $76,000 PPP above Germany and the United Kingdom, within reach of the United States. It does this under a multi-party democratic system with peaceful transfers of power, a free press, and the world's most advanced semiconductor industry run in Chinese by a majority Han population under a democratic polity. That last part is what threatens the paradigm. Singapore is rich and ethically Chinese majority, but Beijing's frame describes it as a small city-state with no civilizational claim. Hong Kong was rich and Chinese, but governed under a colonial holdover, and the paradigm absorbed it by ending that exception in 2020. Taiwan is the only large, durable, prosperous, self-governing Chinese polity in existence. MacArthur's description cannot hold a polity richer than Japan. Meanwhile, the population Beijing claims as part of its sacred territory has, by every available measure, moved away from the mainland. National Chengchi University has run the same identity question every year since 1992. That year, 17.6% of respondents identified as Taiwanese only, about 25% as Chinese only, and 46% as both. By 2023, the figures sit around 63% Taiwanese only, 30% both, and 2 to 3% Chinese only. Among under 40s, the Chinese only figure runs near zero. The 2014 inflection has a name. The Sunflower Movement occupied Taiwan's legislative yuan for 24 days. The trade agreement at issue was shelved. The DPP won the presidency 2 years later by 16 points and has held it ever since. Tsai Ing-wen called the cohort that came of age in that chamber the natural independence generation. The label is precise. For them, a self-governing Taiwan is not a position they argue for, it is simply the water they grew up in. Any move towards the mainland would have to argue against that baseline, not for it. This makes the structural picture worse for Beijing. The party most willing to make concessions to the mainland, the KMT, is the party least able to deliver Taiwan's electoral consent for them. No KMT presidential candidate has won the popular vote since 2012. In October 2025, the KMT elected Chung Li-won as chairperson, a figure who told Deutsche Welle that Putin is not a dictator and who attributed the war in Ukraine to NATO expansion. The mainland of 2010 was negotiating with Ma Ying-jeou. The mainland of 2030 will be negotiating with a population for whom Ma is a historical figure that their parents might have voted for. In Kuhn's language, the anomalies keep piling up. A scientific paradigm under that kind of strain eventually gets abandoned. A political one held in place by a state does not get abandoned so easily, which is the whole problem. When you cannot revise the paradigm and you cannot ignore the anomaly, the remaining option is to remove it. The Xi document that tells you the most about Taiwan was discovered behind closed doors in December 2012, less than a month into his rule, to party cadres in Guangdong. Publicly, the trip was about reform. He laid a wreath at the Shenzhen statue of Deng Xiaoping. Privately, he told a different story, later leaked by the journalist Gao Yu, who was sentenced to 7 years for it. The most cited passage: why did the Soviet Union disintegrate? An important reason was that their ideals and beliefs had been shaken. In the end, nobody was man enough to stand up and resist. He went on with palpable contempt about Yeltsin standing on a tank while the military stayed neutral. A big party was gone just like that. 4 months later, the Central Committee General Office issued document number 9 enumerating 7, quote, false ideological trends, end quote, to be combated. Western constitutional democracy, universal values, civil society, neoliberalism, Western journalism, historical nihilism, and questioning reform and opening. The operative concern was identical to the Guangdong speech. Ideological softness would do to the CCP what it did to the CPSU. Xi is the first PRC leader who governs as if that failure mode were the central design constraint of his tenure. The anti-corruption purge, the army restructure, the patriotic educational revival, and the elimination of presidential term limits all line up against the same threat model. A great party gone just like that, because no one inside it could remember what it was for. Inside of that frame, Taiwan reads less like a sovereignty dispute and more like the alive exhibit the rejuvenation story has to keep absorbing. The 2022 white paper says, in its operative line, that resolving the Taiwan question is, quote, indispensable for the realization of China's rejuvenation, end quote. Without it, the story does not close. The narrative pressure would be one thing if the hardware were not moving in the same direction. It is. In Beijing's western suburbs, the PLA is digging a wartime command center across roughly 1,500 acres, about 10 times the footprint of the Pentagon. The Financial Times reported on the project in 2025, citing U.S. intelligence and satellite imagery showing more than 100 cranes. Completion is expected around 2027. Hardened underground command facilities are designed for the threats a state believes will get through its air defenses. China has the densest layered air defense network on Earth around Beijing. If the planning assumption were that the network would hold, there would be no economic case for 1,500 acres of mountain-backed bunker. The facility is sized for a scenario in which something like the B-21 Raider, the bunker-busting GBU-57, or both reach the airspace over Beijing. The B-21 had its first flight in November 2023. Low-rate production began in 2024. The bunker's 2027 completion sits on the same timeline as the bomber reaching operational numbers. It is a statement of what the planners think the worst case looks like, and it is louder than any speech. Some of this is just baseline nuclear survivability doctrine. Every major power hardens its command structure. But the scale, the timing against the B-21's production ramp, and the depth point past routine continuity of government towards a specific assumption that in a high-end fight, the air defenses around the capital might not hold. The regional periphery is hardening in step. Japan's 2022 national security strategy named China its, quote, greatest strategic challenge, end quote. The Type 12 anti-ship missile is being extended 900 to 1,200 kilometers and reclassified under a new counterstrike doctrine, meaning it can be fired at targets on the Chinese mainland. A surface-to-air unit is going onto Yonaguni Island, 110 kilometers from Taiwan. From the lookout there, Taiwan's central mountains are visible to the naked eye. In November 2025, Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi told the Diet that a Chinese blockade of Taiwan could constitute a, quote, survival-threatening situation, end quote, the precise legal trigger for collective self-defense under Japan's 2015 legislation. The day after, Beijing's consul general in Osaka posted, then deleted, a line about cutting her neck off. Within days, Chinese travel agencies canceled hundreds of thousands of flight bookings to Japan. TSMC, meanwhile, is moving faster outside Taiwan. Mass production at the second Arizona fab has been pulled forward to the second half of 2027 with 3nm and 2nm processes. A Kumamoto fab is producing. Dresden is being built. Roughly 30% of TSMC's 2nm and below capacity will sit outside Taiwan once the build-out completes. Each move slightly weakens the silicon shield, and the deterrent that was supposed to make Taiwan untouchable gets a little thinner every year. Inside the regime, the calibrating forces have been visibly hollowed out. At least 36 generals and lieutenant generals have been purged since 2022, including 2 former defense ministers, the entire top tier of the PLA rocket force, and the commander of the Eastern Theater Command, which would run any Taiwan operation. General He Weidong, vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, became the first sitting CMC vice chairman with a professional military background to be purged since the Cultural Revolution. Bloomberg reported in 2024 that U.S. intelligence had identified Chinese missile silos with water in their fuel tanks and silo lids that would not open. The near-term reading is that this makes the PLA less ready, but the structural reading is a bit harder. When subordinates selected for loyalty cannot deliver bad news upward, the leader's situational awareness degrades. Analysts learn that confirming the leader's priors is the path to budget. Dissenters absorb the career risk. Eiri Hota's reconstruction of the 1941 Imperial Conferences describes a system in which every Japanese principal individually believed war with the United States would end in destruction, yet none could break ranks. H.R. McMaster documented the same dynamic in Lyndon Johnson's escalation in Vietnam. Stephen Koetken's reading of the run-up to Putin's 2022 invasion make the case in living memory. The FSB's Fifth Service had spent years collecting payment in Kyiv to validate the prediction that the Ukrainian regime would collapse in days. We cannot see inside Xi's briefings the way we now can inside the Kremlin's or Johnson's, so the argument is not that we have caught this sort of mechanism operating. It is that Xi has spent a decade building the exact conditions under which it operates, and we know from every prior case what those conditions tend to produce. A small window into Xi's private thoughts appeared after his May 2026 summit with President Trump. The Financial Times, citing U.S. officials, reported that Xi told Trump that Putin, quote, might end up regretting, end quote, the 2022 invasion. Beijing called the report completely false, and Trump denied it. The report may not hold up. Single-sourced accounts denied by everyone named in them often don't, but notice what the denials are denying. Not that the question is absurd, only that Xi said it. The question of whether a personalist leader with a captive information apparatus can badly misread his own window is live enough that all 3 governments wanted distance from it. The standard Western model of Xi's Taiwan calculus runs through a rational actor weighing material costs against material benefits. The destruction of TSMC's fabs, sanctions, casualty estimates, and/or the risk of nuclear escalation. The math holds on its own terms, but it runs on a utility function that Xi has spent 14 years telling his cadres he does not use. Because inside his frame, the cost of inaction is also very real and growing. Every year Taiwan continues to function as a self-governing Chinese-speaking democracy, the story of a successful alternative to the Communist Party of China gets thicker. Every TSMC fab built abroad weakens the Silicon Shield. Every Japanese missile placement east of the Strait raises the military cost of waiting. Every Taiwanese election adds another cohort for whom an independent Taiwan is the baseline. Both prices are moving up at once. The intersection is what defines the window. Put the curves on the same axis and they cross somewhere in the late 2020s or early 2030s. I read that band as roughly 2027 to 2032. Reasonable people who look at the same evidence land on wider or narrower windows, and some look at it and conclude the costs are simply too high for Xi to ever move. The window is a judgment about when the cost of waiting and the cost of acting comes closest to balancing, not an arbitrary date on a calendar. Xi has removed almost every calibrating force from his system. Markets, elections, succession battles, inter-elite consensus, and the press. What remains is the framework he installed in the museum 11 days into his rule, with the inner circle in matching dark suits, walking through dark gray rooms, watching the walls lighten and the narrative advance towards the present, pausing at a glass case about a treaty signed in a fugu restaurant. None of this predicts that war will happen. It is a structural observation. A paradigm under accumulating anomalies, run by a leader who has spent over a decade telling his party that the previous big communist regime died of precisely this disease, is sitting at the front edge of a window where operational readiness and the regional lattice line up. The question is whether the narrative cost of doing nothing eventually grows faster than the operational cost of acting. If you want to stay current on how I'm thinking through questions like this, join my newsletter. The link is in the description. I write there with the room to handle the parts that a video has to compress. If this video helped you see the Taiwan question in a way you hadn't before, subscribe to the channel. There is more coming, and I would rather you not miss it. I'll see you in the next one.